gratitude despite the fact that 6 months of the execution came with a caveat. Julius Jones was now served life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Julius Jones deserved nothing less. Julius privileged for the government to accept the recommendation of his partner War Board that gave him the same recommendation to grant Julius a commutation of life with the possibility of parole. He gave him life without parole. Julius doesn't deserve to spend the rest of his life in prison because Julius is an innocent man.
Still, where there is life, there is hope, and Julius Jones remains alive, if not free. Then, just about 24 hours later, a Wisconsin jury returned a verdict in the murder trial of Kyle Rittenhouse.
A jury in Wisconsin today found the 18-year-old from Illinois not guilty on all charges. Rittenhouse shot and killed 2 protesters and wounded a third in August of 2020.
Not guilty on all 5 charges, including first-degree reckless homicide and first-degree intentional homicide. I'm Melissa Harris Perry, and we begin today's episode of The Takeaway with a question. What is justice, and do we have a legal system capable of delivering it? Joining me now is Paul Butler, the Albert Brick Professor in Law at Georgetown University Law Center and a legal analyst on MSNBC. He's also the author of Chokehold, Policing Black Men. Paul, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Melissa, it's great to be back on The Takeaway.
You know, we just talked last week, but I really wanted to speak with you again, given these 2 outcomes. Can we start with Julius Jones? Are there any more pathways for Jones? Any additional legal remedies, given the governor's decision that he must now serve life without the possibility of parole?
Under the law, Mr. Jones has little hope, unfortunately. In theory, he could bring a case in federal court, what's called a habeas corpus proceeding, but the Supreme Court has made it very difficult for people on death row to win those claims. As you noted, the Oklahoma State Board of Clemency recommended that Mr. Jones receive life with the possibility of parole, and the governor rejected it. The power of clemency is a prerogative that the governor has. It comes from the divine right of kings in English law, and this governor has exercised it in the same kind of random and capricious way a king might. The result is that Mr. Jones is an innocent man who was on death row for 20 years. Now he's an innocent man who is sentenced to life without parole. All that means is that he won't die in Oklahoma's execution chamber. He will just die in Oklahoma State Prison.
When you talk about a sense of capriciousness or injustice, it's clear many people feel similarly about the Rittenhouse verdict. In this case, the assailant, someone who we know committed the killings, but is understood by the law now as having not committed a crime in the context of those killings. Can you help us again to understand the legal reasons, even if not the justice reasons, that this happened?
The verdict does not mean that the jurors bought the Boy Scout image of Rittenhouse that the defense presented, that he was just a medic there to render aid to anybody who was injured at this Black Lives Matter protest. The verdict means that the jury had reasonable doubt that Mr. Rittenhouse was guilty. They weren't 95% certain. But I can't imagine they're happy. These jurors were actually telling about immature and reckless 17-year-old bringing a semi-assault rifle to patrol their streets. And the jurors may be troubled that other people who want to take the law in their own hands may view the verdict as an invitation.
Now, when you sort of talk about it in that way, 17 years old, with this, kind of assault style rifle. Now, the this was a decision. The judge made a decision to dismiss the gun possession charge, and I know that there were some who thought that this was potentially strategic on the part of, ensuring that, like, if they couldn't go for anything else, maybe they'd go for that, but that would be a kind of a smaller charge, and that it had something to do with the actual length of the barrel of the gun. That young people are allowed to have, for example, the rifles if they're going to, go hunting, for example. I'm just wondering about that gun possession charge, and if it maybe indicates we need some reform on those sets of laws.
So it seems like the law in Wisconsin was just poorly written, and the lawmakers might actually have intended to outlaw Mr. Rittenhouse possessing the gun that he had, but the law just didn't capture what their intent was. That was a relatively minor charge, given that Mr. Rittenhouse was also charged with intentionally killing two people and blowing the arm off of another person. This case happened during a Black Lives Matter protest about the shooting of a black man. There were a number of counter-protesters. The scene was chaotic and violent, but as the prosecutor said in his closing argument, the only person who killed anyone was Kyle Rittenhouse.
I'm interested in this question of justice versus law. So it seems that, as a matter of simply the law, that the jury did not do the wrong thing. I mean, they could have made a different choice, but that there is a reading that makes sense for this verdict. But I think for many, including the families of the victims who were killed, this doesn't seem like a just outcome. How do we square justice with legal outcomes?
Criminal trials are poor instruments of social change. So if we look at the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial, he is being brought to justice for murdering George Floyd, but that's different from reforming the police. And so I understand the concerns if, for example, Julius Jones had Kyle Rittenhouse's kind of money for a defense fund, Mr. Jones probably would not have been found guilty. There are lots of concerns about the role of anti-black bias, white privilege, and money in our criminal legal system. And in fact, Kyle Rittenhouse beat his case because he put on the best defense that money can buy. He had a $2 million legal defense fund that allowed his lawyers before the trial to stage these two separate practice jury trials, one in which Rittenhouse took the stand and one in which he didn't. And the fake jurors responded positively to the trial where he took the stand, and that's why he took the stand at the real trial, which is probably the most important reason why he walked. And it's really important to understand, Melissa, that Rittenhouse got all this money because he had a legal defense fund that was cheer-led by people like Donald Trump and Matt Gaetz.
At this point, I think, we've talked a great deal about race in the American legal system, but this point about resources feels to me so critical and maybe under-discussed. Even as you say the words, legal defense fund, I recognize it's a very different kind of legal defense fund, but, just thinking about the transition and power happening at the NAACP legal defense fund as the extraordinary Sherilyn Ifill steps aside and her deputy, the extraordinary Janae Nelson, takes over in that role. And I'm wondering if there's a way to think about how to make resources more equitable. So in the same way that LDF brought resources to the civil rights fight, is there a way to maybe think about this, about maybe bringing more resources to Gideon's Army, to public defenders, or in some way beginning to try to level that resource playing field?
it certainly would advance equal justice under the law if every accused person had the same kinds of resources that Rittenhouse had. At the same time, we can't discount the power of his whiteness. It's impossible to imagine the right embracing the cause of a young black man who bought a semi-automatic rifle to, let's say, a Stop the Steal rally and ended up killing 2 people and blowing the arm off of another. So Rittenhouse, for his supporters, the reason he got all this money is because he's white. His whiteness is a crucial part of his appeal.
As you look out on the sort of framework of vigilantism in the post-Rittenhouse moment, should we be concerned about more Kyle Rittenhouses?
Whether he deserves it or wants it, Rittenhouse is now the poster child for reactionary white men who want to take the law in their own hands, who want to bring assault weapons to Black Lives Matter protests, and who think that violence is a legitimate form of political discourse. This verdict makes every American less safe.
Paul Butler, law professor at Georgetown University and author of Chokehold, Policing Black Men. Thank you for joining us today.
It's always a pleasure, Melissa.
Proudly supporting WHYY DeSales University. DeSales MBA program offers flexibility and personalized plans of study. Students can finish their MBA in as little as 1 year or on their own schedule. 15 concentrations are available, including healthcare administration, data analytics, cybersecurity, and more. Applications are being accepted for the upcoming winter session. Learn more about DeSales University's MBA program at desales.edu/MBA.
It is 2:20 and you are listening to WHYY 90.9 FM. We're going back to the takeaway.
You're listening to The Takeaway with Melissa Harris Perry from WNYC and PRX in collaboration with WGBH Radio in Boston.
On Friday, House Democrats finally came together to pass the $2 trillion Build Back Better bill. It's legislation intended to improve the social safety net in the U.S. Now, about $19 billion in the act will be directed towards public health spending. And of that, hundreds of millions will be spent training and supporting nurses. Now, you've probably heard headlines sounding a bit like this.
Tonight, we look at how the shortage of nurses is affecting healthcare workers and hospitals.
There is a nursing shortage, not only here at the hospitals in Texas, but also in Louisiana.